The horn sounded twice, and the crowd went quiet so fast it felt like the whole valley had stopped breathing. Ysera stood at the center of the stone circle with her arms crossed, looking bored. Behind her, rows of Vashari soldiers watched from the ridge, their pale armor catching the morning light. In front of her, on the human side of the line, hundreds of people pressed together, afraid to speak, afraid to hope. She had already beaten 4 men that morning. 4 champions, each one stronger than the last, each one sent forward by a different human kingdom hoping their best fighter would finally be the one to end her long streak of victories. Each one had lasted less than a minute. She had not even drawn her second blade for any of them. Now she turned in a slow circle, letting her voice carry across the open field. "Is that all?" she said. 4 men, and none of them worth the walk out here." Nobody answered her. A woman near the front covered her mouth with her hand. An old man looked down at the ground, unable to watch anymore. Ysera smiled, and it was not a kind smile. She had fought in this same circle for 6 years, against 6 years of human champions, and she had never once lost. Her name alone was enough to make grown soldiers hesitate before a fight even began. She liked that. She liked it more than winning. "Here is my offer," she said, raising her voice louder now, so it would reach the very back of the crowd. "One more chance. Any human who steps into this circle and defeats me, in fair combat, may claim me as their own. I will serve them. I will follow them. I will never raise a hand against them again." She let the words sit in the air, watching the crowd's faces change from fear to confusion, to something like anger. "Of course," she added, tilting her head, "none of you will manage it. But it costs me nothing to offer, since none of you ever will." The silence that followed was heavier than before. A few soldiers in the crowd shifted their weight, glancing at each other, none of them stepping forward. They had all seen what happened to the last 4. Nobody wanted to be the 5th name added to that list. Ysera waited. 10 seconds. 20. She began to turn away, already bored of the challenge, already planning to walk back up the ridge to her camp. Then a voice came from the back of the crowd. "I'll fight you." Every head turned. The crowd parted slowly, reluctantly, as a young man made his way forward. He was not dressed like a soldier. He wore a plain gray coat, worn at the elbows, and carried no weapon that anyone could see. His boots were splattered with dried mud from the long walk to the front lines. He did not look like someone who belonged in a circle built for combat. His name was Corin, and until 3 days ago, he had spent his war patching up the wounds of better fighters than himself, kneeling in the dirt behind the front lines, while battles raged just out of sight. He had held the hands of soldiers as they died. He had run out of bandages more times than he could count. He had watched too many friends carried away on stretchers, their names added to lists that nobody liked to read out loud. He was done watching. Ysera looked him over, and her expression shifted from boredom to something close to amusement. "You," she said, "you are not even a soldier." "I've fought," Corin said, though he did not raise his voice the way the others had. "Just not the way you mean." Laughter rippled through the Vashari ranks on the ridge. One of the soldiers called out something in their own language that made several others laugh harder. Ysera did not laugh, but she smiled again, wider this time. "A healer," she said, as if the word itself was funny to her. "They sent a healer to face me." "Nobody sent me," Corin said. "I came on my own." That seemed to catch her off guard, just for a moment. She studied him more closely, the way someone studies an animal that has wandered somewhere it should not be. "And why would you do that? You have seen what happens in this circle. You helped carry away the last 4 men who tried." "I did," Corin said. "I wrapped their wounds myself." "Then you understand what you are choosing." "I understand," he said, "that somebody has to stop saying no." For a moment, nobody in the crowd moved. Then, slowly, a murmur began to spread, passing from person to person, like a current beneath still water. Some of it was disbelief, some of it was pity. A few voices, quiet at first, began to say his name, as if saying it might somehow protect him. Ysera raised one hand, and the murmuring stopped instantly, the crowd's fear of her stronger than their sympathy for him. "Very well," she said. 3 days from now, at the same hour, we meet here again." If you survive that long without changing your mind, I won't change my mind. They never think they will, she said, already turning away, dismissing him with her back the way she had dismissed the four before him. But you have 3 days to reconsider, healer. Use them wisely. She walked back up the ridge without looking at him again, her soldiers falling into step behind her, some of them still laughing quietly among themselves. The human crowd stayed frozen for a long moment after she disappeared over the hill, as if unsure whether what had just happened was real. Then they turned to look at Corin, and he felt the full weight of their stares for the first time. Some looked at him with pity, certain they were looking at a dead man walking. Others looked at him with something closer to anger, as if his choice was an insult to the 4 champions who had already fallen that morning. A few, mostly the younger ones, looked at him with a spark of something that might have been hope, though none of them dared to say it out loud. An older woman stepped toward him, her face lined with worry. She had been the one covering her mouth earlier. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Nobody would think less of you for walking away." "I would," Corin said. "She has never lost. Not once. Not in 6 years. You have seen what she does to soldiers twice your size." "I have," he said. "I've also seen what happens to people who stop trying." The woman did not have an answer for that. She simply nodded, once, and stepped back into the crowd, letting him pass. Corin walked away from the circle alone, his mind already working through everything he had just done. He had no training in combat beyond the basics every field medic learned to defend a wounded patient during an attack. He had never held a real blade in a real fight. He did not know the first thing about defeating a warrior who had never lost. But he knew people. He had spent years watching how bodies moved, how muscles tired, how fear and anger changed the way someone fought. He had watched soldiers push themselves past exhaustion and seen exactly what that cost them afterward. He had learned, without ever meaning to, the difference between strength and control. 3 days was not enough time to become a warrior. It might be enough time to become something else. By the time he reached the edge of the camp, word of what happened had already spread ahead of him. Soldiers stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. Some offered quiet nods of respect. Others shook their heads, certain they were watching a man walk toward his own funeral. A group of younger recruits whispered to each other, already placing bets on how long he would last. Corin ignored all of it. He had 3 days, and he intended to use every hour of them. He found the medical tent empty except for a young soldier resting after a minor injury, and beside the cot sat a woman he did not recognize, her arm in a makeshift sling, staring hard at a folded map spread across her knees. Her name, he would soon learn, was Marin, and she had once been one of the sharpest tacticians in the human army before she was cast out of command for arguing too loudly against the generals, who refused to change their old, failing strategies. She looked up as he entered, her eyes narrowing with interest rather than surprise. "You're the healer," she said, "the one who volunteered. Word travels fast. Word travels faster than sense does, apparently." She folded the map and set it aside, studying him with the same careful attention she might have given a battle plan. "You know she has never lost a single fight in that circle. I've heard. You know every man who has faced her had more training than you, more strength than you, and better weapons than you. I've heard that too." Marin tilted her head slightly. "And yet you still think you have a chance." "I don't think I can beat her the way the others tried to," Corin admitted. "If I fight her the way she wants to be fought, I'll lose in a minute, just like the last 4. Then how do you plan to fight her?" Corin was quiet for a moment, thinking through the question honestly for the first time since the words had left his mouth back in the circle. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know she's never had to fight someone who refuses to fight her way. I think that might be the only thing that gives me a chance." Marin studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. She had spent months watching the human command make the same mistakes over and over, sending strong fighters into fair fights against an opponent who thrived on strength and fairness both. She had argued for a different approach more times than she could count, and every time she had been ignored. Here, finally, was someone willing to listen. 3 days, she said slowly, is not enough time to teach you how to fight. I know. But it might be enough time to teach you how to think. She reached for her map again, spreading it back across her knees. though this time, she turned it toward him instead of away. "Sit down, healer. If you're serious about this, we have a great deal of work to do, and very little time to do it in." Corin sat. Outside the tent, the sun continued its slow climb across the sky, marking the first few hours of 3 days that would decide everything. Word of the challenge reached the far edges of the camp before the afternoon was over. Cooks whispered about it over their fires. Guards on the outer watch traded rumors as they changed shifts. Even the wounded, resting in rows of narrow cots, asked each other in quiet voices whether the story was true, whether a healer with no weapon and no training had really agreed to stand where 4 trained soldiers had already fallen. Some called it foolish, some called it brave. Most were simply afraid to hope, having learned over 6 long years that hope in that circle only ever led to grief. Corin heard none of it. He sat with Marin long after the sun went down, a single lamp burning between them, sketching rough lines across scraps of parchment, testing ideas and throwing most of them away. He did not think about the crowd, or the whispers, or the 4 names already lost. He thought only about the next 3 days, and about the woman on the ridge who had never once been forced to fight someone who refused to play by her rules. The first full day began before sunrise, with Marin shaking Corin awake, before the camp had even begun to stir. "If we're doing this," she said, "we start now, while your mind is still fresh, and your fear hasn't caught up with you yet." Corin rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and followed her out into the gray light of early morning. She led him not toward the training grounds where soldiers practiced their forms, but toward the rows of tents where the wounded and recovering were kept. The same tents where Corin had spent most of his time over the past several months. "We're not going to teach you to fight like a soldier," Marin explained as they walked. "There isn't time, and even if there were, you'd never match her strength. So instead, we're going to learn everything we can about the person you're actually facing." "I've only seen her from a distance," Corin said. "In the circle, twice now." "Then it's a good thing this camp is full of people who've seen her much closer than that." Their first stop was a tent near the edge of camp, where a soldier named Elric sat propped against a stack of blankets, his left arm wrapped tightly and resting in a sling. He had been one of the 4 champions who faced Isra months earlier, in a challenge held before Corin arrived at the front. He looked up as they entered, his face guarded, clearly expecting mockery or pity, unused to visitors who wanted neither. "I heard what you did," Elric said to Corin, his voice flat. "Everyone has heard by now." "I need to know how she fights," Corin said, not wasting time on the things everyone already knew. "Not the stories. What you actually saw, standing across from her." Elric was quiet for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, the guardedness softening slightly. Nobody had asked him this before. The generals who sent him into the circle had wanted results, not details. The soldiers who visited afterward wanted stories to repeat around their fires, not careful observations. "She's fast," Elric said finally. "Faster than she looks, given her size. But she doesn't fight smart. She fights to end things quickly, because she's used to opponents who can't survive more than a few exchanges. The moment she senses weakness, she commits everything to finishing the fight in that instant. And if she doesn't sense weakness right away, then she gets frustrated. I saw it happen, just for a moment, before she recovered. I lasted longer than the others that day, and near the end, she stopped fighting carefully and started fighting angry. That's when she made her only mistake. That's also when she ended it, because by then, I had nothing left to defend myself with." Corin absorbed this in silence, turning the information over in his mind. Marin, standing beside him, was already sketching notes onto a scrap of parchment, her handwriting quick and precise. "Thank you," Corin said. "Truly." Elric studied him for a long moment. "You're not going to win by being stronger than her," he said. "Nobody is. If you're going to win at all, it'll be because you found a way to make her angry, without letting her finish you first." They spoke to 2 more veterans that morning, both of whom had faced Isra in earlier years, before the current string of 4 fresh losses. Each account added new pieces to the growing picture Marin was building. One soldier described how Asera favored her right side slightly, a habit so small it had gone unnoticed by everyone, except a man who had spent his final moments in that circle, studying her every movement, searching desperately for an opening he never found. Another described the specific sound her boots made against stone just before she launched into a strike, a small warning that most opponents were too afraid to notice in the moment. By midday, Marin had filled 3 full pages with notes, diagrams, and half-formed theories. She spread them across a table in the empty medical tent, and she and Corin studied them together as the sun climbed higher outside. "Here's what we know," Marin said, tapping the pages one by one. "She's strong, faster than most people expect, and completely confident in her own ability to end a fight quickly. Every single opponent she's faced has tried to match her, strength against strength, speed against speed, and every single one of them has lost, usually within a minute or two, because she's better at that kind of fight than any of them were." "Exactly. So we don't give her that kind of fight." Marin pulled a fresh piece of parchment toward her and began sketching a rough circle, representing the arena where the duel would take place. "If you can't win by matching her, you win by refusing to give her what she wants. You make the fight last. You make her chase you. You let her spend all that strength and speed on strikes that never land, until she's the one running out of options, not you." Corin studied the diagram carefully. "Elric said she gets frustrated when a fight doesn't end quickly. That frustration is what beat her defenses for a moment, even though it also ended his fight." "Right, because he had nothing left by that point to take advantage of the opening."
"But you," Marin said, meeting his eyes, "you don't need to overpower her in that moment."
"You just need to be ready for it when it comes, and you need enough left in you to act on it. Which means I need to survive long enough to see that moment arrive. Which means," Marin said, "we spend the next 2 days making absolutely sure you can." The rest of that day was spent in careful, unglamorous work. Marin had Corin practice moving, not fighting, learning how to shift his weight quickly, how to change direction without losing his balance, how to read the ground beneath him so he would never stumble at the wrong moment. She borrowed a blunted training blade from the camp armory, not to teach him elaborate strikes, but simply to help him understand its balance, its weight, the way it moved through the air when swung with intention rather than desperation. "You're not trying to win exchanges," she reminded him again and again. "You're trying to survive them, and to make her spend more than she gains every time she tries." By evening, word of Corin's preparations had spread through the camp, carried by soldiers who had wandered past the training yard and seen him practicing strange, careful movements that looked nothing like any fighting style they recognized. Some mocked it openly, certain they were watching a man waste his final days on nonsense. Others watched more quietly, uncertain what to make of it, unable to shake the memory of Elric's account, of the one moment where even Isera had shown a flicker of something less than perfect control. Across the ridge, in the Vishari camp, similar whispers were beginning to spread, though the tone there was different. Scouts who had watched Corin's strange practice sessions from a distance reported back with barely concealed amusement, describing a human who seemed more interested in running in circles than in learning to hold a blade properly. The reports reached Isera that evening, and she listened to them with the same bored expression she wore for most things that did not directly challenge her. "Let him practice his running," she said, waving the report away. "It will not save him." But one of her advisors, an older Vishari named Ren, who had watched more duels than anyone else in the camp, lingered after the others had gone, a faint line of concern creasing his weathered face. "He asked to speak with everyone who has faced you," Ren said carefully, "including Elric, from the 3rd year." Isera's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a small stillness settling over her that had not been there a moment before. "Elric lost. He did. But he also lasted longer than any of the others before him, and you yourself once told me that fight tested you more than the rest." "It tested nothing," Isera said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "I finished it, same as all the others." "You finished it," Ren agreed, "after losing your patience first." Isera said nothing to that, and after a moment, Ren bowed slightly and left her alone with her thoughts. She sat in silence for a long while after he had gone, turning the memory over in her mind, a memory she had not examined closely in a very long time. She remembered the frustration that had built in her that day, the strange sensation of a fight lasting longer than she expected, the moment where her calm had cracked just slightly before she ended it. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself the healer was no different from any of the others, that his strange training methods and quiet determination changed nothing about the outcome that awaited him in 3 days. She almost believed it. The second day passed much like the first, filled with careful, deliberate preparation rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Corin spoke with 2 more soldiers who had witnessed different duels over the years, gathering small details that Marin carefully added to her growing collection of notes. He practiced his movements until his legs ached and his lungs burned, learning to control his breathing so that exhaustion would not betray him too early in a fight that might last far longer than anyone expected. In the evenings, Marin pushed him through exercises meant to sharpen his focus under pressure, forcing him to make quick decisions while tired, while distracted, while his body wanted nothing more than to stop and rest. She was demanding in a way that surprised him, pushing harder than he expected from someone who had spent so many months being pushed aside herself. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Corin asked her, late on the second night, as they sat together reviewing the day's progress by lamplight. Marin was quiet for a moment before answering. "I spent years telling the generals there were better ways to fight this war than throwing our strongest soldiers at problems that strength alone could never solve. Nobody listened. They kept sending champions into that circle, one after another, and one after another they kept losing, exactly the way I said they would." She looked up at him, something fierce and tired in her eyes. "You're the first person who's actually willing to try it a different way. I'm not going to waste that chance." Corin nodded slowly, understanding settling over him with new weight. This was not only his fight anymore. It belonged to Elric, who had come closer than anyone before him. It belonged to Marin, who had spent years arguing for exactly this kind of approach. It belonged, in some quiet way, to everyone in the camp who had watched 4 champions fall that morning and felt the last of their hope slipping away. By the time the second day ended, Corin could feel a change in himself, subtle but real. He was not stronger than Isra, and he never would be. He was not faster, and he never would be. But he understood, in a way he had not understood 3 days earlier, exactly what kind of fight he needed to create, and exactly what it would cost him to see it through. 1 day remained before the circle would call him back. He intended to spend every hour of it getting ready. That night, after Marin had finally gone to rest, Corin walked alone to the edge of the camp, where the fires burned low, and the sound of the wind moving through the grass was the only thing left to listen to. He sat on a low rock overlooking the dark shape of the ridge in the distance, the place where the Vishari camp lay quiet under the stars, and he allowed himself, for the first time since he had stepped forward 3 days earlier, to feel the full size of what he had agreed to do. He was not a fighter. He had never wanted to be one. He had chosen the path of a healer because he believed there was more worth in mending what war broke than in adding to the breaking. And yet here he was, 1 day away from standing in a circle built for exactly the kind of violence he had spent years trying to undo. He thought of the 4 champions who had fallen that morning, men he had treated afterward, wrapping wounds that would heal slowly, if at all. He thought of Elric, whose arm might never fully recover its strength. He thought of every name added to every list he had ever read, every soldier he had not been able to save. He did not want to add his own name to that list, but more than that, he did not want to spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he had simply stayed silent that morning, if he had let the crowd's silence become his own. A sound behind him made him turn, and he found Elric approaching slowly, his injured arm still resting in its sling, his steps careful in the dark. "Couldn't sleep either," Elric said, lowering himself onto a nearby rock with a small wince. "Too much to think about." "That's normal." Elric was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same dark ridge Corin had been studying. "I thought about a lot of things, the night before my fight. Mostly, I thought about how badly I wanted to win, and how little that wanting seemed to matter once I was actually standing across from her." "Did you regret it?" Stepping forward, Elric considered the question carefully before answering. "No," he said finally. "I regret losing. I regret what it cost me. But I don't regret trying, because the alternative was watching someone else's name get added to that circle's history, while I stood in the crowd and did nothing." He glanced sideways at Corin. "You're not fighting the same fight I fought. You've built something different, something she's never faced before. I don't know if it's enough, but it's more than any of us managed. That's not exactly comforting. Elric allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first Corin had seen from him. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be true. Tomorrow, when you're standing in that circle, and everything in you wants to freeze, remember that you built something none of us thought to try. Remember that, and trust it. They sat together in silence for a while longer, two people who had both walked toward the same fear from different directions, before Elric finally rose, wincing again as he shifted his weight, and made his way back toward the tents. Corin remained a while longer, watching the stars move slowly overhead, until the cold finally drove him back toward the warmth of the camp, and whatever rest he could manage to find before the final day began. The morning of the third day arrived clear and bright, with a thin mist still clinging to the low grass around the stone circle. By the time the sun had fully cleared the ridge, the crowd had already gathered, larger than it had been 3 days earlier, word of the challenge having spread far beyond the immediate camp. Corin stood near the edge of the circle, dressed in a light tunic that allowed him to move freely, carrying the same borrowed training blade he had spent the last 2 days learning to trust. Marin stood beside him, going over the plan one final time, her voice low and steady despite the tension visible in her hands. "Remember what we practiced," she said. "Don't chase her. Let her come to you, and when she does, don't stay still long enough for her to finish the exchange. Move, always move, and make her spend everything trying to catch you. I remember. And when the opening comes, and it will come, don't hesitate." Elric hesitated for half a second, and that half second cost him the fight. Corin nodded, his eyes fixed on the ridge where the Vishari camp waited, still quiet in the early light. "You can do this," Marin said, and for once there was no tactical calculation in her voice, only simple conviction. "I wouldn't have spent 3 days on this if I didn't believe it." The horn sounded, twice, the same signal that had opened the challenge 3 days earlier, and the crowd's quiet murmuring fell away into complete silence. Corin stepped into the circle. A moment later, Ysera appeared at the opposite edge, walking with the same unhurried confidence she always carried, her twin blades resting easily at her sides, her expression carrying the faint amusement of someone who expected the morning's business to be finished quickly. "Still here," she said, stopping several paces away, studying him with open curiosity. "I half expected you to reconsider. I told you I wouldn't." "You did." She rolled her shoulders once, loosening the muscles along her back, a small habitual motion that Corin recognized from Elric's description, and something in him steadied slightly, grateful for every hour spent gathering these small pieces of knowledge. "Very well, healer. Let's see what 3 days of preparation bought you." She moved first, closing the distance between them faster than Corin expected, faster than anything he had practiced against, and only the hours spent learning to read her footwork saved him from the opening strike. He shifted his weight and stepped aside at the last possible moment, her blade passing close enough that he felt the air move against his skin, and he did not stay to test his luck a second time. He retreated immediately, putting distance between them, circling wide instead of standing his ground. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. This was not how the previous 4 fights had gone. Those men had stood their ground, had matched her strike for strike, had tried to prove their strength was equal to hers. Corin did the opposite, refusing every invitation to trade blows directly, always moving, always keeping the space between them just wide enough that her next strike fell short. Ysera's confident expression flickered, just slightly, replaced for a moment by something closer to irritation. She pressed forward again, faster this time, her blades moving in a pattern designed to close off his escape routes, to trap him against the edge of the circle where retreat would no longer be possible. Corin felt the pressure of it immediately, his heart pounding as he read her movements and adjusted his own path at the last possible second, slipping past her flank instead of into the trap she had built. "Stand and fight," she said, her voice sharper now, the first real edge of frustration showing beneath her earlier calm. "Or are you only capable of running?" Corin did not answer. Answering cost breath, and breath was the one resource he could not afford to waste. He kept moving, kept circling, forcing her to turn, to chase, to spend her strength chasing an opponent who refused to give her the fight she wanted. The crowd, initially confused, began to shift in their understanding as the exchange continued. What had looked like cowardice in the first moments began to look like something else entirely, a deliberate strategy unfolding in real time. Whispers spread through the human ranks, quiet at first, then growing louder as the fight stretched past the point where all 4 previous duels had already ended. On the ridge, the Vishari soldiers watched with a different kind of tension building among them. This fight had already lasted longer than any challenge in 6 years, and the discomfort of that fact was visible in the stiffening postures along the ridgeline, in the way conversations that had started with easy amusement fell gradually into uneasy silence. Isra pressed her advantage again and again, each attack faster and more aggressive than the last, and each time Corin found the narrow gap that let him escape without giving ground he could not afford to lose. His arms burned from the effort of constant motion, his lungs ached with every breath. But he held to the plan, refusing to let exhaustion push him into a mistake, refusing to give her the single opening she needed to end things the way she always had before. At the edge of the circle, Marin watched every exchange with fierce concentration, her hands clenched at her sides, mouthing silent counts under her breath as she tracked the rhythm of the fight. Beside her, Elric stood with his good arm braced against a wooden post, leaning forward, his eyes never leaving the center of the circle. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would change anything happening in front of them now. On the ridge above, Ren watched with a different kind of unease building in his chest. He had seen every duel fought in that circle for the last 6 years, and none of them had ever lasted this long. He glanced sideways at the younger Vishari soldiers near him, noting the way their earlier laughter had faded into something quieter, something closer to concern, though none of them would have admitted it aloud. Isra struck again, a fast diagonal cut aimed to catch Corin as he shifted direction, but he had already anticipated the angle, dropping low and letting the blade pass over his shoulder with barely a hand's width to spare. He felt the wind of it against his neck, close enough that his pulse spiked sharply, close enough that for one terrible instant his body wanted to freeze entirely. He did not let it. He kept moving, kept circling, forcing his legs to carry him wide around her flank before she could recover her stance and press the advantage. "You're quick," Isra said, breathing harder now, though she tried to keep the strain from her voice. "Quicker than I expected from someone who spends his days wrapping wounds instead of making them. I've had good reasons to move fast, working where I work. Pulling soldiers off battlefields, I imagine. Something like that." She attacked again before he finished speaking, using the brief exchange of words as cover for the strike, a trick Corin recognized just in time from one of the veteran accounts Marin had gathered. He twisted aside, feeling the blade catch nothing but air, and used the momentum of his own turn to put several more paces of distance between them. The pattern continued, strike after strike, each one aimed slightly differently, testing new angles, searching for the gap in his defense that had not yet appeared. Corin's arms had begun to shake with the effort of constant readiness, his legs heavy with a fatigue that no amount of preparation could fully hold back. He forced himself to remember Marin's warnings, forced himself to focus on breathing, on watching, on refusing to let his body's exhaustion become the mistake that ended everything. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The fight stretched on longer than anything the crowd had witnessed before, and the strain began to show clearly on both sides of the circle now. Corin's movements were growing slower, his reactions costing him more effort than they had at the start. But across from him, Isera's strikes were losing their careful precision as well, her breathing growing heavier, her frustration bleeding more visibly into every motion. "Why won't you fight properly?" she said, her voice rising, genuine anger breaking through for the first time. Every one of them stood and fought. "Why won't you do the same?" "Because standing and fighting is what you're good at," Corin managed, forcing the words out between careful breaths. "I'm not going to help you win." Something in her expression shifted at that, a flash of something that might have been recognition, quickly buried beneath renewed aggression. She surged forward again, abandoning some of the careful control she had shown at the start of the fight, her strikes coming faster and with less restraint than before. Corin felt the change immediately, the increased danger of her recklessness, but also, just as clearly, the opening it created. He remembered Elric's words. She gets frustrated when a fight doesn't end quickly, and that frustration is what beat her defenses for a moment. The moment was here. He could feel it building, could see it in the widening gaps between her strikes, in the way her balance shifted slightly further off-center with each aggressive lunge. He forced himself to keep moving, keep watching, keep waiting, for the exact instant Marin had told him to trust. Ysera lunged again, committing fully to a strike aimed to end the fight in a single decisive motion, exactly the kind of finishing blow that had ended every previous duel in this circle. But Corrin was already moving before the strike landed, sidestepping at the last possible fraction of a second, letting her momentum carry her past him instead of through him. And in that single unguarded instant, he acted. His blade found her side, not deep, not final, but real, the first actual contact of the entire fight, drawing a thin line across her arm, where her guard had briefly, completely, dropped. The crowd's gasp was audible across the entire field, a sound so sharp and sudden it seemed to echo off the distant ridge itself. Ysera stumbled back, one hand pressing instinctively against the shallow wound, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something rawer, something that looked almost like shock. She stared down at her own arm as if the sight of it did not make sense, as if 6 years of certainty had just been quietly, permanently disturbed. For 6 years, no human blade had ever touched her. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it that morning. It was not the silence of fear, or the silence of grief. It was the silence of an entire crowd watching history bend in a direction nobody had believed possible. Ysera looked up from her arm, and the expression on her face had changed completely. The bored confidence was gone. The easy amusement was gone. What remained was something far more dangerous, a raw, focused fury that radiated from her like heat from an open flame. "You," she said, her voice low and shaking with barely controlled anger. "You actually—" She did not finish the sentence. She simply attacked again, abandoning every last trace of the careful control that had defined her fighting style for 6 unbroken years, throwing herself forward with pure, unrestrained force. Corrin barely managed to avoid the first strike, and the second came close enough that he felt the edge of her blade catch against his sleeve, tearing fabric without touching skin. He was running out of room to retreat. His legs, already exhausted from minutes of constant movement, were beginning to slow despite everything he could do to fight through the fatigue. Ysera, meanwhile, seemed to have found a fresh well of strength in her fury, each strike coming faster and harder than the one before it. This was the danger Marin had warned him about. An enraged opponent is not a weaker opponent, she had told him, more than once. She is a more dangerous one. Reckless, yes, but also stronger, faster, willing to take risks. A careful fighter never would. Don't mistake her anger for an advantage until you see exactly how she's spending it. Corrin forced himself to keep watching, even as exhaustion pulled at every muscle in his body, even as fear screamed at him to simply run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the fury bearing down on him. He watched the pattern of her strikes, searching for the same small tells Elric had described, the same subtle habits that had guided him through every exchange up to this point. And there, buried beneath the recklessness, he found it. She still favored her right side, even now, even in the grip of pure fury. Every combination she threw ended with a slight lean toward that same familiar direction, a habit too deeply ingrained to disappear even when everything else about her fighting had changed. He had one more exchange left in him. He could feel it in the trembling of his own legs, in the burning exhaustion running through every part of his body. If this next moment did not work, he would not have the strength left to create another chance. Ysera came at him one final time, blades raised, every trace of her earlier composure completely gone, replaced by something raw and desperate to end this fight before it could humiliate her any further. Corrin waited until the last possible instant, watching the familiar lean begin in her stance, and then he moved, not away this time, but into the narrow space her own habit had left open, closing the distance, instead of running from it, trusting everything Marin had taught him, everything Elric had told him, everything 3 desperate days of preparation had built toward this single, decisive moment. Marin, watching from the edge of the circle, felt her own breath catch in her chest. She had built the plan, had walked Corrin through every possible version of this moment during their long hours of preparation, but seeing it unfold in real time, with everything riding on a single instant of timing, was entirely different from planning it on paper. She dug her fingers into the wooden post beside her, unable to look away, unable to do anything now but watch. Elric, beside her, had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the narrow gap Corin was moving toward, the same gap he himself had glimpsed once, briefly, before it closed too fast for him to use it. He found himself silently urging Corin forward, every muscle in his own body tensed, as though he were the one stepping into that space instead of watching from the sidelines. On the ridge, Ren had risen from his seated position without realizing it, his hand gripping the hilt of his own blade out of pure instinct, though there was nothing for him to do but watch along with everyone else. Around him, the Vishari soldiers had gone utterly silent, the earlier laughter and easy confidence replaced entirely by a tense, uncertain focus none of them had expected to feel that morning. Corin's body moved almost before his mind fully caught up with the decision, muscle memory built over 3 exhausting days, finally taking over where conscious thought could no longer keep pace. He felt the familiar lean-in Isera's stance, the same small habit Elric had described days earlier, the same tell that had guided every successful evasion since the fight began. This time, instead of using it to escape, he used it to close the distance, stepping directly into the space her own momentum had opened. Time seemed to slow in a way it had not slowed at any other point during the fight. He was aware of the sound of his own heartbeat, loud and fast in his ears. He was aware of the strain in his legs, the burning exhaustion in his arms, the sharp, focused clarity that sometimes arrived only in moments of extreme necessity. He was aware, most of all, of the narrowing gap between himself and an opponent who had never once, in 6 long years, allowed anyone to close that gap successfully. The crowd held its breath as both figures came together in the center of the circle, and for one long, suspended second, nobody watching could tell which way the outcome would fall. The 2 figures collided in the center of the circle, and for a moment, neither the crowd nor the soldiers on the ridge could tell what had actually happened. Then Isera's blade fell from her hand, striking the stone ground with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Corin stood with his own blade pressed carefully against her side, his other hand gripping her wrist, holding her arm locked in a position that left her unable to reach her second weapon. His legs shook with exhaustion, his chest heaved with every breath, but he did not let go. For 6 years, nobody had ever seen Isera disarmed. She stood frozen for a long moment, staring down at her fallen blade as though it belonged to someone else, as though the sight of it lying useless on the stone did not make sense to her mind, even with the clear evidence in front of her. Her second blade remained sheathed at her side, out of reach, held there by the careful position of Corin's grip on her arm. "Yield," Corin said, his voice rough with exhaustion but steady. The terms were clear. "Yield, and this ends." She did not move. Her eyes, when they finally lifted from the fallen blade to meet his, carried an expression he had not expected, something raw and unguarded beneath the anger, something that looked almost like disbelief, turned inward rather than outward. "Say it," he said, not unkindly, but firm, in front of everyone. "You offered the terms yourself." Around them, the entire crowd remained utterly silent, waiting, hardly daring to believe what they were watching. On the ridge, the Vishari soldiers stood frozen as well, none of them moving, none of them speaking, the weight of what was happening settling slowly over the entire field. Isera's jaw tightened. For a long moment, it seemed as though she might refuse entirely, might fight against the grip holding her in place regardless of the cost, her pride warring visibly against the reality standing in front of her. But finally, slowly, something in her posture changed, the fight draining out of her shoulders, replaced by a stillness that looked almost like defeat settling into her bones for the first time in her life. "I yield," she said, the words quiet at first, then louder, forced out with visible effort. "The terms are honored. I yield." The silence that followed broke apart all at once, the crowd erupting into a sound unlike anything the circle had witnessed in 6 years, a mixture of disbelief and relief, and something close to joy, that swept across the entire field like a wave. Soldiers who had watched 4 champions fall just 3 days earlier now stood shouting, some embracing each other, some simply standing in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just seen. Corin released his grip slowly, stepping back, giving Ysera space, though he kept his blade lowered rather than raised, no longer a threat now that the terms had been formally spoken and heard by everyone present. He was breathing hard, his whole body trembling with the aftermath of exhaustion and adrenaline both, but he did not celebrate, did not raise his arms in victory the way the crowd clearly wanted him to. Instead, he looked at Ysera, who stood very still, staring at her own empty hand, as though trying to understand what had just happened to it. Marin reached him first, pushing through the crowd with Elric close behind her, both of them arriving at his side just as his legs finally began to give out from the strain of everything the fight had demanded of him. Marin caught his arm, steadying him, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief that mirrored the crowd's reaction perfectly. "You did it," she said, her voice unsteady in a way he had never heard from her before. "You actually did it." "Barely," Corin managed, forcing a tired smile, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of him. Elric clasped his good hand against Corin's shoulder, unable to find words adequate to the moment, settling instead for a firm, silent grip that said more than speech could have managed. But even as the crowd's celebration continued to grow around them, Corin's attention remained fixed on Ysera, who had not moved from where she stood, who had not spoken since the moment her yield had been forced from her lips. He extracted himself gently from Marin's grip and crossed the remaining distance between them, ignoring the ache in every muscle, ignoring the way the crowd's noise seemed to fade into the background as he approached. Ysera watched him come with wary, guarded eyes, her posture stiff, braced for whatever humiliation she assumed would follow, the kind of humiliation she herself had dealt out freely to human champions for 6 long years. "The terms are honored," Corin said quietly, once he stood close enough that only she could hear him clearly. "That's all. I'm not going to make a spectacle of this." Something flickered across her face, confusion replacing the wariness for a brief moment. "You defeated me," she said, her voice tight with something that was not quite understanding. "In front of my own soldiers. In front of everyone." "I did. And you're not going to use that." It was not quite a question. "I don't need to humiliate you to prove I won," Corin said. "The terms speak for themselves. Everyone watching heard you yield. That's enough." Ysera stared at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes, an expression Corin could not fully read but recognized as unfamiliar to her, as though the situation itself had presented her with a problem she had no experience solving. 6 years of victories had never prepared her for this particular kind of aftermath. Behind them, the crowd's celebration continued, though a few had begun to quiet, watching the exchange between the two figures at the center of the circle with growing curiosity. On the ridge, Ren watched with careful attention as well, noting the restraint in the young healer's posture, the complete absence of the cruelty he had expected from a human victor standing over a defeated Vishari warlord. "The other champions," Ysera said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them. "The ones I defeated. I never offered them anything close to this kind of restraint." "I know. Why show it to me then?" Corin considered the question honestly before answering, aware that whatever he said now would matter far beyond this single moment, would shape whatever came next between them, in ways he could not fully predict. "Because the terms were about ending something," he said finally, "not starting something worse. If I make this into another kind of cruelty, I've just replaced your cruelty with my own. I didn't come here for that." Ysera did not respond immediately. She glanced past him, toward the crowd still celebrating in the distance, toward the ridge where her own soldiers stood in stunned, silent formation, watching a scene none of them had ever expected to witness. Her expression, when she finally looked back at Corin, carried none of the fury or contempt that had defined every previous interaction between them. "This will not be easy," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, "for either of us." "I didn't expect it to be." A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began to realize the fight had truly ended, that the impossible outcome they had witnessed was not some trick of exhaustion or imagination, but simple, undeniable fact. Cheers rose again, louder this time, spreading outward from the circle toward the edges of the camp, carried by soldiers eager to share the news with anyone who had not witnessed it directly. Marin approached again, more carefully this time, aware of the delicate exchange still unfolding between Corin and Isra. "The formal terms will need to be recorded," she said quietly, addressing them both, "witnessed by representatives from each side, so there's no question later about what was agreed to here today." Isera's expression tightened slightly at the reminder, the reality of her new circumstances settling more firmly into place with each passing moment. But she did not argue, did not resist, simply nodded once, a small, stiff motion that cost her something visible in the doing. "Then let it be recorded," she said. "I gave my word before this fight began. I will not dishonor it now, regardless of how little I expected to need to keep it." As the formal witnesses began to gather, drawn from both the human camp and the small group of Vishari soldiers still standing frozen on the ridge, Corin allowed himself, finally, a moment to simply breathe, to let the full weight of what had happened settle over him, now that the immediate danger had passed. His body ached in ways he had never experienced before. His mind still struggled to fully accept that the fight was truly over, that he had somehow survived what every instinct in the camp had warned him was impossible. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the disbelief, something else was beginning to take shape as well, something he did not yet have words for. He glanced toward Isera, who stood a short distance away, watching the gathering witnesses with an expression caught somewhere between resignation and something far less certain, and he found himself wondering, for the first time, what exactly came next for either of them. The formal recording took nearly an hour, longer than Corin expected, though he understood why once the process began. Representatives from 3 different human kingdoms insisted on adding their own signatures to the record, each one wanting undeniable proof that the terms had been witnessed and confirmed beyond any possible dispute. On the Vishari side, only 2 soldiers stepped forward willingly, Ren among them, while the rest remained at a careful distance, their expressions unreadable, clearly still processing what they had witnessed that morning. Ren approached the small table where the terms were being written out, his eyes moving between Corin and Isera with careful attention. 6 years, he said quietly, mostly to himself, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I did not think I would live to see this day." "Neither did I," Isera said, her voice flat, though something beneath the flatness suggested the words cost her more than she let show. Once the record was complete, signed and witnessed by representatives from both sides, a strange stillness settled over the field, the earlier celebration having quieted into something more thoughtful, more uncertain. Nobody quite knew what came next. There was no precedent for this situation, no established custom for what happened after a Vishari warlord yielded to a human challenger in front of both armies. Marin took charge of the practical questions first, as she often did, addressing Corin in a low voice, while Isera stood a short distance away, flanked awkwardly by Ren and the small group of witnesses. "You'll need somewhere for her to stay," Marin said. "Somewhere secure, but not a cell. The terms didn't specify captivity, only service. Treat this wrong, and you undermine everything you just accomplished." "I know. Do you, though?" Marin studied him carefully. "Because half this camp is going to want her locked away out of fear, and the other half is going to want her paraded around as a trophy. You're going to have to hold a line neither side wants you to hold." Corin looked toward Isera, who stood with her arms crossed now, her posture rigid, clearly bracing herself for whatever indignity she assumed was still coming. He thought of Elric's wounded arm, of the 4 champions who had fallen before him, of every soldier he had treated over the long months of this war. He thought, too, of what Isera herself had said, just minutes earlier, about not expecting restraint and receiving it anyway. "She keeps her own tent," Corin said finally, "guarded, but not caged. She's not a prisoner. She's bound by her word, the same as I'm bound by mine, to treat her fairly." Marin studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "That's going to be a hard sell to some people in this camp. Then I'll make the argument as many times as I need to." By early afternoon, word of the outcome had spread far beyond the immediate camp, carried by messengers, riding out toward the nearest settlements, toward command posts, still holding on to grim expectations, after 3 days of losses. The reaction, when it arrived, was mixed in ways Corin had not fully anticipated. Some soldiers treated him with open admiration, approaching to offer thanks, or simple words of respect he did not know how to receive gracefully. Others regarded him with open suspicion, uncertain what to make of a healer who had somehow accomplished what 4 trained champions could not, and even more uncertain what to make of his insistence on treating their longtime enemy with something resembling fairness. Ysera, for her part, said very little throughout the remainder of the day, allowed to stand near the edge of the circle, while the practical arrangements were finalized around her. She watched the human camp with careful, guarded attention, studying faces, studying reactions, clearly trying to understand a situation that offered her no familiar reference point. 6 years of certainty had collapsed in the space of a single morning, and nothing in her experience had prepared her for what remained on the other side of that collapse. When evening finally arrived and the crowd had mostly dispersed, drifting back toward their own fires and their own quiet conversations about everything they had witnessed, Corin found himself standing near Ysera once more, both of them worn down by a day that had asked more of each of them than either had expected to give. "You could have humiliated me," she said, breaking the silence between them, without looking at him directly. "You had every right to, by the terms I offered myself. Nobody would have blamed you. I would have blamed myself." She turned to study him then, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "I don't understand you," she said, and there was no contempt in the words this time, only genuine, uncomfortable confusion. "Every human I have faced in that circle wanted the same thing I wanted, only pointed in the opposite direction. You don't seem to want that at all." "I wanted the fighting to stop," Corin said simply. "That was always the whole point, not to become something worse than what I was fighting against." Ysera said nothing to that, though something in her posture shifted slightly, some small piece of the rigid defensiveness she had carried all day easing, just barely, into something quieter. She looked out toward the darkening ridge where her own soldiers had begun setting their evening fires, the familiar rhythm of camp life continuing, despite everything that had changed that morning. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "will be harder than today. I imagine it will. You have won a fight, healer. You have not yet won anything else." She turned and walked toward the tent that had been prepared for her, her steps measured, her back straight, despite everything the day had cost her, leaving Corin alone with the last light of evening and the quiet, uncertain weight of everything still ahead. Ysera was right about one thing. The days that followed the duel were harder than the duel itself, though the difficulty took a shape neither of them had fully anticipated. For the first week, she resisted nearly everything. She refused to eat with the rest of the camp, insisting on taking her meals alone in her tent. She answered questions in short, clipped sentences, offering nothing beyond what the terms strictly required of her. When Corin visited to check on her, as he did each morning out of some combination of obligation and genuine concern, she treated him with a wary, guarded politeness that felt more like distance than respect. "You don't have to check on me every day," she told him, on the 4th morning, not quite looking at him as she spoke. "The terms don't require it." "I know. Then why do you keep coming?" Corin considered the question honestly. "Because pretending you don't exist doesn't seem like a good way to hold up my end of an agreement about treating you fairly." She said nothing to that, though he noticed, over the following days, that her responses grew slightly less clipped each time he visited, as though some small part of her was testing whether his consistency was genuine or simply another kind of performance she had not yet learned to recognize. The camp itself remained divided in its reaction to her presence. Some soldiers avoided her entirely, unable to separate the woman confined to a single guarded tent from the warlord who had ended the lives and careers of soldiers they had known personally. Others, driven by curiosity, or something closer to morbid fascination, found excuses to walk past her tent more often than necessary, watching her with open, uncomfortable stares that she endured with rigid, silent dignity. Marin, ever practical, worked to establish clear boundaries that protected Ysera from the worst of the camp's hostility, while also addressing the legitimate fears many soldiers carried, after years of losses in that circle. She arranged for a small rotation of guards, chosen specifically for their fairness rather than their hostility, and she made clear, in conversations with camp leadership, that any mistreatment of the terms Corin had established would not be tolerated quietly. "You're spending a great deal of political capital defending someone half this camp still fears," Marin told Corin one evening, roughly 2 weeks after the duel, as they walked together along the edge of the camp. "I know. Do you regret any of it? Corin thought about the question carefully before answering. No, he said, but I understand why some people think I should. Marin studied him for a moment, then let the subject drop, though the careful attention in her expression suggested she was still turning something over in her thoughts, some question she had not yet decided whether to ask aloud. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift, as Sarah began accepting meals with a small group, instead of eating entirely alone, though she rarely spoke during those meals, watching the easy, familiar rhythms of human camp life with the careful attention of someone studying an unfamiliar language. She began answering questions with slightly longer sentences, offering small pieces of context that revealed, gradually, a person far more complicated than the warlord who had mocked 4 fallen champions from the center of a stone circle. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the duel, Corin found her sitting alone outside her tent, watching the sunset with an expression he had not seen on her before, something quiet and unguarded that seemed almost startling against the memory of her earlier hostility. "May I sit?" he asked, and she glanced up at him, considering the request for a long moment before nodding once. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the colors shift slowly across the sky, before Isera finally spoke. "I have been trying to understand something," she said, "and I have not found an answer I am satisfied with." "What's that?" "Why you did what you did, not the duel itself. I understand why you fought. I understand less why you continue to treat me the way you have, every day since." She turned to look at him directly, her expression carrying none of the guardedness he had grown used to over the past weeks. "I spent 6 years believing strength was the only thing that mattered, the only thing worth respecting. Every human who faced me tried to prove they had more of it than I did, and every one of them was wrong. You never tried to prove anything like that at all." "I couldn't have, even if I wanted to," Corin said. "I was never going to be stronger than you. Matching you was never an option. And yet you won anyway. Because I wasn't trying to win the way the others tried to win. I was trying to end something, not to prove something." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "You built your whole life around being unbeatable. I think some part of you needed to find out what happens on the other side of that, even if you didn't want to find out that way." Isera was quiet for a long moment, her eyes returning to the darkening sky. "You may be right," she admitted finally, the words clearly costing her something significant to say aloud. "I do not know who I am, now that I am no longer unbeaten. I built everything around that single fact for 6 years. Without it, I find myself uncertain in ways I have never experienced before. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It does not feel good, healer. Most honest things don't, at first." She glanced at him again, something almost like the beginning of a smile touching the corner of her mouth before she caught herself and let it fade. "You have an answer for everything." "Not everything. Just the things I've had time to think about." As the weeks continued to pass, the camp gradually settled into an uneasy but functional rhythm around Isera's presence. The initial fear and hostility never disappeared entirely, but it softened, tempered by the simple accumulation of time and small, consistent proof that she posed no threat to the terms she had sworn to uphold. Some soldiers remained distant, unwilling to forgive what she had cost them personally, and Corin never asked them to. But others, slowly, began treating her with something closer to ordinary civility, extending small courtesies that would have seemed impossible in the first days after the duel. Elric, of all people, was among the first to soften. He approached her directly one afternoon, roughly a month after the duel, finding her alone near the edge of camp. "I lost to you," he said, without preamble, his voice steady, despite the obvious weight of the memory. "Months ago, before he ever stepped into that circle." Isera studied him carefully, clearly bracing for hostility she had learned to expect from soldiers who recognized her. "I remember," she said simply. "I spent a long time being angry about it. Angrier, maybe, than I let myself admit." Elric glanced toward his still healing arm, resting in its sling. "I'm not saying I've forgiven everything. I'm saying I watched you these past weeks, and I don't see the same person who beat me that day. I don't fully understand what changed, but I see it." Isera said nothing for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her, carefully composed expression. "Thank you," she said finally, the words quiet but genuine. That means more than you likely realize. Word of small exchanges like this one spread slowly through the camp, softening attitudes gradually, in ways that no single announcement or decree could have accomplished. Ysera herself changed as well, though the change came slowly, built from countless small moments rather than any single dramatic turn. She began offering her own observations during meals, instead of simply watching in silence. She began asking questions about human customs she had never bothered to understand before, curious, in a way that surprised even herself. And she began seeking out Corin's company deliberately, rather than simply enduring his visits out of obligation, finding excuses to walk alongside him during his rounds through the camp, listening as he explained the small, practical work of tending to soldiers' wounds and worries alike. "You could have been many things," she told him one evening, nearly 2 months after the duel, as they walked together along a quiet stretch of the camp's perimeter. "A soldier, a leader, even a warlord, in a different life. Instead, you chose to spend your days easing the suffering of others, expecting nothing in return." "I never thought of it as a choice exactly. It just felt like the only thing worth doing, once I understood what the alternative looked like. The alternative being war. The alternative being cruelty," Corin said. "War is just cruelty, organized into something that pretends to have rules." Ysera considered this in silence for a while, her expression thoughtful in the fading evening light. "I understood cruelty very well, for a long time," she said eventually. "I am still learning to understand the alternative. You're doing better than you think. Perhaps." She glanced at him, something warmer than mere curiosity present in her expression now, something that had grown slowly, carefully, over the 2 months since a stone circle had first brought them together as enemies. "I did not expect, when I offered that challenge, that losing might turn out to be the beginning of something worth having. Neither did I, honestly. I just wanted the fighting to stop." "And has it?" Corin thought about the question carefully, considering everything that had changed since the morning he had stepped forward from a frightened, silent crowd. The war around them had not ended, not entirely, not yet. But something smaller and more immediate had shifted permanently, a single crack spreading slowly outward through 6 years of certainty on one side and 6 years of fear on the other. "It stopped between us," he said finally. "That feels like a place worth starting from." Ysera did not answer immediately, but as they continued walking together through the quiet evening camp, something settled between them that had not been there before. An understanding built not on victory or defeat, but on the slow, patient work of two people learning, gradually and honestly, how to see each other clearly for the first time. The uncertain alliance they had built would be tested again in the months ahead, by soldiers on both sides still uneasy with a peace that had arrived through such an unlikely path, by the larger war still unresolved beyond the boundaries of their small camp, by the simple difficulty of building trust between two people who had begun as enemies in every sense that mattered. But that evening, walking together beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, neither of them felt the need to solve every uncertainty at once. The test came sooner than either of them expected. Near the end of the second month, a small delegation arrived from the Vashari command, sent to assess the situation firsthand, after weeks of uncertain reports reaching their distant strongholds. At the head of the delegation stood a stern, imposing figure named Halric, one of the few Vashari commanders who outranked Isra in the old order of things, his expression carrying open disapproval from the moment he entered the camp. "This is beneath you," he told her, once they were finally alone together near the edge of the human camp, his voice low, but sharp with contained anger. "Yielding to a healer, living among them, as though the terms of some foolish challenge actually bind a warlord's judgment. The terms bind my word," Ysera said evenly, though Corin, watching from a careful distance, could see the tension in her shoulders. "And my word has always meant something, even to those who found it inconvenient. Your word was given in a moment of arrogance, expecting no consequence. Nobody expects you to honor it, now that the consequence has proven real. I expect it of myself." Halric studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his stern expression. "The others are calling you weak," he said. "Some are already speaking of replacing you, of finding a new warlord who has not embarrassed our people in front of a human army. Let them speak. You would give up your position so easily? I would rather give up a position built on a broken promise than keep one built on dishonoring my own word, Isera said, her voice steady, despite the visible cost of the conversation. I chose this outcome the moment I offered those terms. I will not pretend otherwise now, simply because the outcome proved inconvenient to my pride. Halric left the following morning, his disapproval unresolved, his warnings about what might follow left hanging unanswered in the air behind him. Isera said little about the visit afterward, though Corin noticed a new weight settling over her in the days that followed, a quiet awareness that the fragile peace they had built together remained vulnerable to forces neither of them could fully control. He's not wrong, she admitted to Corin one evening, several days after the delegation's departure. There may be consequences, eventually, for what I've chosen. My own people may not forgive this as easily as some of yours have begun to. Are you having second thoughts? No. The answer came without hesitation, firm and immediate, in a way that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. I am afraid of what may come. That is different from regretting the choice that brought me here. Corin considered her words carefully, understanding the distinction she was drawing, even as he recognized the courage it had taken to draw it honestly. Whatever comes, he said, you won't be facing it alone. That's not how this works anymore, whether either of us fully understands what comes next. Isera looked at him for a long moment, something steady and grateful passing behind her eyes, an expression that had grown more natural to her with each passing week since the duel that had first, unexpectedly, brought them together. I am beginning to understand that, she said quietly. It is still strange to trust it fully. 6 years taught me that trust was a weakness I could not afford. And now? Now, I am learning that perhaps I was wrong about a great many things, for a great many years. She allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the kind that had become steadily more familiar over the past 2 months, though it still carried a trace of surprise, as though she had not fully expected to find herself capable of such an expression anymore. You have a great deal to answer for, healer. 6 years of certainty, undone by a man who never even raised a weapon before the week he decided to challenge me. I'd call that a fair trade, all things considered. Perhaps, she said, it is. The camp continued to change around them in the weeks that followed, slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably. Soldiers who had once avoided Isera entirely began offering small nods of acknowledgement when they passed her in the common areas. Children among the camp followers, initially terrified of the warlord's presence, grew bold enough to watch her from a careful distance, their fear gradually giving way to simple curiosity. Even Halric's warnings, though never fully forgotten, began to feel like distant thunder rather than immediate danger, a storm that might or might not eventually arrive. Marin, watching the slow transformation unfold with the same careful attention she brought to every tactical assessment, found herself admitting, one evening, that she had never expected the plan she and Corin built together to lead anywhere close to this outcome. I was trying to win a fight, she told him. I never planned for what happened after the fight ended. Neither did I, honestly. Do you regret that it went this way? That it became something more complicated than a single victory? Corin thought of the stone circle where everything had begun, of the 4 fallen champions, of Elric's careful guidance, of 3 desperate days spent learning everything he could about an opponent he had never expected to understand this deeply. He thought of Isra's slow, hard-won transformation, of Halric's warnings still hanging unresolved somewhere beyond the edge of camp, of everything still uncertain in the months ahead. No, he said finally. I don't regret any of it. I just didn't expect an ending. I think I'm starting to understand that this was never supposed to be one. Some things, Corin had learned, over 3 desperate days and everything that followed them, were worth building slowly, one honest step at a time.